I'm going to try to keep us on track here. And Ben Abo, who is also is part of the kind of whole thought process that we've gone through with this idea of safety third. So he's going to be chiming in and helping out with this too. And what I'd really like is to get your perspective on all this. And this is really meant to be um, an interactive thing, and to have some discussion. So speak up, say something, or if Justin, you can, tell me what people are saying in the chat or something. I just love to hear y'all's perspective, because this is, coming to you from our perspective from an United States concepts of risk assessment and the way our EMS systems and stuff work here. And so I'd love to hear how things are from your perspective, and kind of how you apply the same sort of principles, and things that may be completely different here. So just a little bit about me. I like to do a lot of things that involve taking risks, both in my personal and professional lives. This is me on one of our local rivers in a raft, doing some whitewater. Um, I do some search and rescue, both in kind of the urban environment. This is with our local fire department, doing some confined space rescue, which I absolutely despise, but do just because that's one of the things that we do. I work on our local ski patrol. Our mountain's obviously not enormous, but we do have a lot of ice, and so people break a lot of bones. I climb on the ice sometimes when it's rarely now ever cold enough to do that. And also on our mountain rescue team here. And this is a really pretty area near us called the Hickory Nut Gorge, which is probably most famously known for that's where they filmed Dirty Dancing, but it's a great place to rock climb. And also work on our, oh, that's on the wrong order, but I work on our flight service too, air care as a flight physician, which should be familiar to y'all a little bit, but is fairly rare here in the United States to have physicians flying on helicopters at all. And it's unusual. There's a few of us that do it, don't do too much, but it's kind of part of my own thing. So really what we're going to talk about today is the idea of situational awareness. One of the times that we kind of got to thinking about this was a trip I took to Guatemala with one of our colleagues, Sarah Frances McClure. And we were sitting here in an ambulance that we got picked up from the airport by one of our mutual friends going through Guatemala City, right next to a police officer who was enjoying this street performer who was juggling fire right next to the gasoline tanker. And just thought, gosh, wow, this is really a great visual, like explaining like what we do in EMS. A lot of times we're showing up and you can get so focused on like, oh, that's a fun thing that's happening, that you realize that like, well, this guy's juggling gasoline right next to a gasoline tanker. So this is a perfect example of missing the forest for the trees. So this is a saying that we have in the US when we're doing all of our EMT training and education. I'd be interested if you guys do the same sort of thing. So we have these checkoffs where you have to get certified by the National Registry of EMTs, where part of the checklist is that you have to ensure that the scene is safe before you start your scenario. So people always will show up in the simulated case and say, hey, is the scene safe? I'm putting on my BSI. And if you say, is the scene safe? You're told yes, and they check the box and you move on. And so that's how we start our education for EMS in the United States, is by having people check a box that verbalizing that they have checked the scene for safety. Is that something that sounds familiar to y'all? Do you do anything similar to that?
They're all nodding their head, but they want you to explain BSI.
Oh, BSI, Body Substance Isolation. It's a great TLA, or three-letter acronym, that is used to mean that you're putting on gloves. Like that's the thing, is that you're ensuring safety of the scene and safety of yourself. And so the way that we verbalize this in these things, and it gets totally ingrained into every new EMS provider, is that if they just verbalize that they're putting on gloves and ask the examiner, I'm checking the scene for scene safety, is the scene safe, then they're fine and they can move right on. So that's the way we start everything. And the more and more, I did this without thinking for a decade or more, and started to think more about it as we were having these conversations through our wilderness EMS and operational EMS areas. We realized, like, gosh, is the scene safe? Like, well, that's absurd. In some of the areas where we work, there's like, I can't ensure that the scene is safe at all, and in fact, it's incredibly not safe. When we're going to a mountain rescue or a car accident or active shooter scene, these things, there's nothing safe about it, yet that's our job, is to go there anywhere. So I was like, gosh, this seems crazy. Like, that's the way that we're training people. When we look at EMS in certain environments, I mean, we've got stuff that is obviously very hazardous, and we think about safety in a different context. For example, in like military medicine, when we're doing battlefield care, this is by every sense of the term, out of hospital emergency medicine, but and in its purest form. But can you sit there and ask, is the scene safe if you're going to take care of casualties on the battlefield? Well, absolutely not. There's nothing at all safe about it. And in those cases, the hazards are very obvious. They practice situational awareness at all times because your life literally depends on it. And they train in such a way that you train for situational awareness. Sometimes when we go to accident scenes, the hazards are incredibly obvious and they're difficult to miss, right? You go up to a car accident, there's live electrical wires down in the car. That's very obvious. We'll realize, oh, is the scene safe? Well, no, that's not safe. But does that mean you're just going to stop? No, it means you need to do something. Is people still need help, but it doesn't mean that we just completely stop what we're doing, which is kind of what we imply in that model of training, where we say, is the scene safe? Yes, no, go, don't go. And then there's other operational environments where things are like obviously very not safe, yet people need our help. So, this is an extreme example of an extrication of a vehicle off of an edge. But if we look at this picture, we'll see that there's some people that are incredibly involved and are probably thinking quite a bit about the hazards involved. And there's other people there that maybe not quite as involved. So you'll see there's folks there wearing harnesses that are standing on that telehandler with the car, but then there's other people kind of watching from the side, right next to some open space with no harness on, and kind of on the periphery, that are probably not quite as aware of what's going on. For those of us that work in wilderness environments, there's the ever-present danger of the environment in which we work. That can be something as obvious as wild animals, but something as subtle as changing weather and getting cold, and other things that we can't make a binary decision at the beginning of the entire operation. Is this safe or not? And this might be a gray area where we have to ultimately, have to continuously reassess the situation and looking for hazards that may occur that may not be present right now. And the concept of wilderness medicine entirely kind of implies that there's no baseline level of safety. The sort of anthropologic definition of wilderness medicine is laid out in some of the texts, such as Hawkins' Wilderness EMS textbook, defines wilderness medicine as medical care in those areas where fixed or transient geographic challenges reduce availability of or alter the requirements for medical or patient movement resources, and can be further expanded, like in sort of the more anthropological term, is that those areas where the environment has more power over us than we do over it. And in those cases, to kind of come into the entire operation with this idea that I have ensured scene safety, we checked that box, and therefore everything's safe and we should just move on, really, I don't think is setting itself up for a whole lot of success. If we're operating in an environment that we have just out of the gate defined as something that has more power over us than we do over it, to believe that we are safe, I think is setting itself up to not actually be safe in what we'll talk about. There's a lot of things too that we think about, when we think about training for EMS, at least in the United States, we often start with when we reach the patient. But the reality is, when we look at the statistics on where bad accidents and fatalities happen among EMS providers, it's very much more frequently things before you even reach the patient. You don't have to look far to find incidents of paramedics and EMS providers being killed in car accidents on the way to the calls, which is one of the reasons we've been so interested in this idea of lights and sirens usage and trying to appropriately prioritize responses, because we know that in reality the response itself is often the most dangerous part of the entire operation. These scenes just play themselves over and over of ambulance crashes, often with unrestrained providers in the back, and it's just over and over that we see this. Some of the other things that we find that are actually some of the most hazardous things that we do are some of the most routine things we do, like loading patients into ambulances. That is, in the United States, the number one cause of lost time work accidents, and the reason people have to leave the field is due to back injuries from lifting and loading patients. It's incredibly prevalent, and it, certainly the global population in the United States and Southeast, most specifically, people are not getting any smaller, and so this will continue to be an issue for us. And you've probably seen before, right? You go into a factory, you go to a place, and your employer really wants to make sure that you know that they're committed to safety, and they say safety first. You've heard that over and over. It's all over these banners, all over the wall, everywhere. Safety first. And we started to think, gosh, this doesn't seem to make sense. So I would propose the question to you guys. Is there any problem with saying safety first? Am I making a whole big deal out of nothing? Or could you perceive any problems with this concept?
Good response, guys.
Line that against the patient.
Here, Cliff. Everything's relative, and if you stop at safety, you may never get to the patient.
Yeah, that's a great point, right? So like, what's the whole reason we're going to do our job is like, we've got someone that needs help, right? So if you just put a hard stop off whenever anything is remotely not safe, you may never ever reach your patient, right? So that's a great point. I have to look back to like my turnout gear that was issued to me, and it says right there on the top, right there, firefighting is an ultra hazardous, unavoidably dangerous activity. Boy, like if I am being trained on one hand to say safety first, safety is the priority, the number one priority. Oh yeah, by the way, your job is to go into this burning building, and even the piece of equipment that we have to try to make you safer says that it's unavoidably dangerous. Gosh, well, this doesn't seem to add up whatsoever, right? So maybe we need a better approach than just saying safety first, because if we're making rules that we have to initially break as soon as we have to actually do our job, we're not designing a system where we're actually setting ourselves up for success, right? So if you design a policy, but you can't actually do your job without breaking that rule, maybe that isn't a very good rule. So we kind of came up with maybe safety should be third. And there was this show that you guys may have seen before called Dirty Jobs with this guy, Mike Rowe, would go around and do all these kind of, unglamorous jobs where you get really dirty and were often fairly dangerous. And he kind of came up with this concept, laid it out on an episode where they came up with this idea of safety third. I've got a quick video to show you guys, and hopefully this plays about this.
There's no sound on it, Chris. I would.
Oh, okay. Well, there's one. Basically, he goes on and to talk about how this idea is that he's on this crab boat up in the Bering Sea, and he's going around, and he's in this incredible danger. Everyone's working on this ship, and he's like, he goes to the captain after like getting so scared on deck that he's going to die, falling overboard and drown. That he's like, I've been all over your boat and it looks incredibly dangerous, and I haven't seen any signs about safety, and there's no railings, and like, where is the where's all the safety warnings? And the captain looks at him and says, I'm a crab boat captain. My job isn't to get you home alive. My job is to get you home rich. If you want to come home alive, that's on you. And he said that was resonated quite well with him, and it really meant something to me. What it really thinks about for us is really how you define safe. It depends on what we're trying to do. These guys are willing to risk a whole lot because they stand to make a whole lot of money in that case, and they're willing to take extraordinary risks to be able to make a lot of money. Now, what we do is very different. However, we also have a very important job to do. In our case, it isn't necessarily to make a ton of money, but is to save people's lives, right? So if we do want to be safe, because ultimately we want to go home, right? At the end of the day, we want to accomplish our mission, get home to our families. But it really depends on how we define safe. We want to do it safely, but the safest thing we could do is not go at all, right? We risk nothing by not even going. However, like you said, in that case, we'd never get to the patient, right? The safest thing we could do is to never leave the station, never go to these calls at all. But we also have to consider that people generally don't require rescue from completely safe environments, right? That's kind of goes without saying. So why are we sitting here saying safety first, it's a no, go, no go is the only way to assess safety. And there's no room for gray area. At least in the United States, that's the way it's been taught for years and years to EMS providers. And we think that's just complete crap. So realistically, when we get down to it at the end of the day, I don't think safety always is first. Okay. And, we have to think a few things. Like Mike Rowe came up with this idea of, safety third, because if you keep saying safety first over and over, it kind of loses its meaning. And, they began saying safety third to kind of remind each other that, like, hey, you're responsible for your own safety. You need to be doing risk assessment, and like no one else is looking out for you. When those places where they put safety first, or your safety is our number one priority on those banners up on the wall of the factory, is that true? Do you think at the factory they think that your safety is their number one priority? What do you think at the factory their number one priority is?
They are murmuring production and money.
Yeah, production and money, right? Like the reason that factory exists is not to keep its employees safe. It's to make things and make money, right? So them telling you your safety is our number one priority is crap, right? Like, so we have to say like maximizing production is our number one priority, which means not having like workers' compensation claims and people out of work because they're hurt, because then we have to slow down, we have to pay for people's bill, all that kind of stuff, right? So it is a priority, and they don't want people to get hurt. However, let's be honest about what we're doing, right? Let's be completely honest with ourselves about what people's priorities are, and realize that like you need to watch out for your own safety, because they are willing to take a few losses along the way, right? So we have to recognize, though, what we're doing is not a factory, right? Like our job is not to make widgets, because at the end of the day, I'm willing to risk a whole lot less to make some money for somebody making some brooms than I would be to save someone who's on the, who's dying on a cliff, right? So we have to be honest with what we're doing. We also realize that what we're doing is not, scouts, where we're taking people on adventures for the sake of like personal development and things, which is quite important on its own right. But like the mission has to be taken into consideration as well. Like people need help, they need to be rescued. This is not the same sort of risks I'd be taking if I were taking, children outside to do something else. We're also not at a wild, crazy festival where we're just throwing caution to the wind and saying safety third, as often is said in these contexts, where we're essentially just the complete disregard for safety in the sense of having fun, right? So really what we're talking about is risk assessment. So it can be quantified in many cases in sort of the financial word as the probability times the consequence. So in order to do that, we have to kind of know what the probability of something happening is, which is done through research, and we have to understand the consequences, which is often learned through experience. So this is how we can grow and learn. Well, how do we know the probability of these things? Well, we have to train. We have to know our limitations, and the way we find these things is by training all the way up to the point things fail. Okay, we have to understand what we're trying to do. So, what is the task at hand? We have to understand like what are the hazards that we're intended to face. Right? We do this by experience. We do this through training. And then the better question to ask ourselves is, rather than is this safe or not, is like what are the hazards, what is the task, and then how do I best prepare myself for these hazards in order to minimize the risk to myself and to my partner, not is this safe or not. Okay. Famously, Judge George Patton said, you fight like you train. And so this is really important for us in EMS to recognize that as we train, we need to push ourselves to our limitations so that we can find out where our weaknesses are, and know that when we do train, we tend to perform in the same way that we train. So if we get into the habit of training of saying something over and over in some context, we're training our brain to react that way. And if we don't want to try to make binary safety decisions at the beginning of an operation, we probably should not verbalize that while we're training. So just by saying, we're putting on my gloves, ask someone, is the scene safe? We're not going to do that. If you show up on a scene and you ask someone, is it safe? There's no magic person that's going to tell you that it's safe there or not. That's going to be up to you to determine, right? So I hate that kind of approach. Better question is, what are the hazards, right? And so then we have to ask ourselves, how much danger is too much? So at what point do you feel like you're in too much danger? Does anyone have a quick answer for that?
It's going to be different for everyone.
It's different for everybody, is what Garth's saying.
Yeah, it is really different for everyone. This is kind of graphically represented in this idea of the stress continuum, which is talked about quite a bit in psychological first aid. These concepts that you may be familiar with, but everyone can think about this in something that they've done in their life, right? So we have that point at which we're on the continuum between stress and performance. When you are super stressed out, that you're cannot even function, right? You're so scared that you're frozen. And there's also times when you're so low stress that you don't even care. You're not performing very well. And everyone finds that one peak where they have enough stress that they are super focused and dialed and they're performing at their peak. And being able to pay attention to this stuff is how you get to have good situational awareness of recognizing when you are getting into that sort of imbalance and breakdown zone, and having strategies in which you can mitigate that stress to be able to pull yourself back into that peak performance zone. So like we do that by operating in systems that are like designed to set us up for success, right? So with we look at making our systems safer, right? So making ways that we train and have systems that have some inherent function in it that is designed to be safer. We have to ask ourselves, like, well, how do we set ourselves up to have a system where I can respond to feedback that I'm getting to keep myself operating at peak performance, accomplish my mission, and also do this as safely as possible? We have to design good systems. And unfortunately, kind of as we design systems, it's generally in sort of a reactionary manner, which can result in some very complicated systems. Just think to yourself, if you've worked in a place, in an organization or something that has a bad incident, and then makes a reactionary policy to try to prevent that same exact incident from happening again. You do that over and over the course of years, and you get a very complicated system, right? We've learned from the aviation industry from many, many years ago that sometimes keeping a simpler system makes it actually quite a bit safer. So that's a MiG-29 fighter jet. It's a pretty badass plane. The designer of this famously, was asked, what is the safest part of this plane? And to which they responded, the safest part of the plane is the one that we can leave off. What that means is that, really they've decided that they've seen that the more complex a system, the more difficult it becomes to control, because the more complexity there is, the more difficulty there is seeing through that system. There's all sorts of unexpected interconnections, and then it becomes so complicated that humans cannot essentially keep up with the system. We can all think particularly in the medical world, these things get so complex that we can't keep up with what's going on. You don't even realize when it's out of control sometimes. So honestly, when we're designing systems to try to keep them safe, often keeping them very simple without a whole lot of interconnected parts and rules often can allow us to be much safer. If we train to try to know our limitations and know how to respond to the stress continuum, we are often better at keeping ourselves safe than complex systems are that are difficult to understand why they're out of control. Our goal really is having systems where errors do not result in catastrophes. So we can't prevent human error. It's very well, very well known that essentially preventing human error is not possible. We're error making machines. You got to plan for the fact that we're going to make mistakes and that we're going to fail to recognize things. We want to set ourselves up to not have that turn into a catastrophe. So, we change the way that we respond to adverse events. When something does happen, our goal should not be saying, well, they were dumb, that they made a mistake. They should have thought safety was first, and then this would never have happened. They shouldn't have ever left the station, right? But we realize that isn't working, right? So we want to have a culture of autonomy and valuing those people who are actually making decisions and sort of support them to try to make good decisions and make good assessments. And you can only do that by basically being in that area where we're both supported, so that we can stay in a good part of that stress continuum, both before and after these events. We essentially want to assume that people show up to work wanting to do at least a passable job, right? People don't show up to work to take care of people to do a bad job. When we say that, the reason a bad thing happened is because someone was lazy or dumb or whatever, essentially we're saying that people, we're throwing out this concept that people generally want to try to do the right thing. And we have to recognize that often adding additional steps may have unintended consequences. So there's a lot of great, if you're interested in this idea of human error and how these systems can be designed to be essentially inherently dangerous, you can look at some of these books here by Todd Conklin and Sidney Dekker that really dive into the idea of organizational safety and human error, which I think is really interesting in this idea um, of safety and what it really means to be safe in an inherently hazardous environment. So, Dr. Abo has quite a bit to say about just culture, which I think is a very important concept when it comes to keeping our system safe. Ben, I don't know if you want to say a little bit about just culture.
As basically what a lot of this is getting around to. It's not just a person's fault. It's not just, oh, you didn't do this safely, you couldn't accomplish this safely, so therefore it's your fault. It could be the system, and you shouldn't make somebody feel that they are at fault for a mission not being able to be completed when they're just trying to do things to keep things safe. So whenever there's an error, which is not the end of the world, as long as it's recognized and you look at it, it's like, oh, is it the person's fault or is it the system's fault? Or is it a combination of both? And if it is even a person's fault, is it because they didn't train? Is it their attitude? Can it be fixed? So it really is a big difference between a blameless culture and a punitive culture, which is really, really important. There's in the US, in South Florida, there's actually a service that wrote a whole article about just culture. But then when I moved to the area and I saw how they actually operated, they were blaming their medics for things all the time. And they were actually afraid to do patient care of what would have benefited their patients, all because they didn't actually do things the right way. They said it was always human accountability, never system. And instead of nurturing them, everything was looked at punitive, so they were too afraid to do anything. So having just culture for the overall system and having everyone buy into it is extremely, extremely important.
Yeah, so
that brings us right into. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, so that brings us right into this idea, right? So that like, if we have just culture, right, where we're trying to design systems where people are, there's accountability, but at the same time, there's accountability for the system. We're training to try to, recognize our own limitations, try to be able to operate at our peak performance, and also this concept of training all the way up to the point of failure, so that we actually know where our limitations are. Right, our limitations may be physical, they may be psychological, they may be gaps in our knowledge. So one of the greatest things you can do is train all the way up to the point that everything breaks down, and then you can learn from these things before before it ever have to learn that lesson on a scene. So we'd like to propose to you, if we're saying safety is third, you guys throw out real quickly a suggestion. You think, well, something has to be first and second. Then we've got our own ideas, but what do you guys think?
Operational risk profiles.
I have a guess.
Operational risk profile.
Our operational risk profiles, our procedures to go with those profiles, our training that brings us up to a level that we can all operate in a base of normality in an unsafe environment before we step once we step outside of a normality of what we're trained to do, that's when things become unsafe. So if we're operating within those profiles and doing as we have been trained, our scene is essentially safe through our organisation's provision of those things.
Is it safe or is it safe-ish? Those are really good points. And overall, things are always dynamic. So it's not like a check off once we're there, it's kind of done. But those are excellent points. And a lot of it comes down to what you were saying, the overall overarching priority and risk mitigation. It's good.
Anyone else have any other, like a catchy first and second?
Let's have what we came up with, Chris.
We've got a suggestion.
Yeah.
Something we do here is the 0-point survey, so focusing on self and team and then environment, so our physical and psychological preparedness first, so we're ready, and then ensuring the team is ready, and then we figure out the environmental stuff.
Yeah, the 0-point survey I think is just like a phenomenal tool to use in this situation. Like absolutely fantastic. It's definitely, I mean, that I feel like that is like peak performance right there using that. And that really gets to what we're, to kind of our thoughts on what our priorities are. For example, so first of all, if you're going to say safety first, that's catchy, right? So we needed to come up with something that was equally catchy and provocative, right? So if you don't get people fired up a little bit, you'll never get anywhere, right? So we really said first is getting it done. So, and what this means in our idea is we have to ask that question, like we have, like in looking at an operational risk profile. First of all, what is the objection? Like, what is the objective? Are we going on a body recovery? In which case, what's your risk profile or your tolerable risk profile for a body recovery? Should be pretty low, right? Versus if you're going on a mission where someone is in dire need of immediate assistance and has a great chance of survival. That's Go ahead, Ben.
With this, what Chris is getting at too is like everyone, depending on the risk, the profile of the mission, we all have different limitations, and it's up to all of us to know and understand or have an idea of our own limitations to really know is this worth that risk? For me, I had an incident where someone fell in the New York subway before the train came. For me, it was a no-brainer. I'm jumping in the subway tracks and pulling them out. That might not be the same, and that's okay with other people. So the fact is that all of our jobs are important, and we have different limitations. That's okay, but you have to understand them, and you can't say, oh, automatically everyone's supposed to do it, because you can't ignore the sacrifices, and that's definitely a possibility.
Yeah. So that's one of the things that I like to say is like we have to recognize first that like not everyone's going to make the same decisions in every environment, and that comes back to that just culture, is that we recognize that we are individuals operating in a system within parameters that we're trained to, but some of these things come down to judgment calls that are based on personal experience, based on our physical abilities, technical abilities in certain environments, that we should recognize that, and particularly retrospectively when we're analyzing these things, take into account in our culture in quality assurance and things that we have to account for these people making decisions, within like their risk tolerance, their personal risk tolerance, their operational risk tolerance, all of that being different in everyone. Okay, it's second of all, okay, so if we say that first is getting it done, second we said is having fun. So this is probably the most inflammatory of these two, because really what it could sound like is, hey, hold my beer, watch this, as we like to say in the South, right? Is that we're just out there to have a good time, and like, whatever, if we get killed, who cares, right? Well, it doesn't really mean that. And what we meant to say, this is really is a gut check. This is about operationalizing and normalizing, checking in on yourself and your teammates and recognizing where you are on that stress continuum, because often that can be one of the leading indicators that things have changed in this dynamic environment, of saying that if we just say, oh, safety is a yes or no question, that is not training us to have a basically head on a swivel situational awareness, where we are constantly checking on how are we doing, right? Are we still doing okay? Are we getting into that red zone? Okay, this is also an important part of job satisfaction. What we do is very stressful, and it can be very, very, it can lead to high levels of burnout, which is super high in emergency medicine and emergency medical services. And prioritizing satisfaction and enjoyment, which means trying to avoid a punitive culture, which is essentially punishing people for trying to do the right thing. So, which is really important. We lose so many people every year out of emergency medicine to attrition for so many reasons, and not to mention suicide, which is, is kind of the elephant in the room among emergency responders. So prioritizing that kind of culture is just as important, and it really underpins the whole idea of safety. And so third, safety.
That's I was just gonna say that's the whole reason why we do what we do. What got us into it, what keeps us into it, is another way of looking at it. And then third,
well, it's safety, because it's, you got to put it somewhere, right? But the problem is really you can't get the job done if you're not being safe, right? Like, so if you're going out there and you're crashing your helicopter, you never make it to the scene because you're driving like a maniac, you get hurt as soon as you show up, you get shot by the active shooter, you are not going to get to the patient either, right? Like you have to be able to take risks, but that needs to be a calculated risk. Recognize the fact that this environment is not inherently safe. We need to mitigate the risks that we can, accept the ones that we can't, and learn from what we can, right? So you can't get the job done and you can't have a good time if you're being so wildly unsafe that you're not accomplishing your mission. So although it may be the most important thing, it's often not the first thing that we talk about. So really my take home points from all this is, number one, know your limits. The way that we know our limits is by training hard and training all the way up to the point that our systems break down. We get into uncomfortable zones. We fail. That's so important. You got to train like it's real. The way when things get stressful that you're going to operate is the way that you train. And just saying, oh, well, this is just training, so we're not going to do this is really is not giving yourself the best chance to be as good as you can be. We want to understand the objective of our mission and the associated hazards, not just ask, is this a safe mission or not? We want to stay vigilant. That's how we continue having fun, right? Is recognizing where we are on that whole continuum. We recognize that accidents happen. Sometimes we can't do anything about it. We need to learn from them. We not to be punitive about them. And we need to avoid making our systems so complex that they are out of control without us realizing it. And lastly, love your job. It's really important. What we do is matters. What we do is really important. People's lives depend on what we do, and you shouldn't take that for granted. It's not everybody's willing to take the sort of risks and sacrifices that you do. That's just something you should be proud of, and just rediscover or rekindle your passion for why you got into doing this stuff in the first place. Some of these concepts are explored further in the text Wilderness EMS by Hawkins, which Ben and I are both authors in, sort of conflict of interest disclosure. But we love this conversation. I think there's a lot of good stuff going on in the sort of operational EMS world, kind of looking at safety as not a binary decision point. And we really welcome any other comments that you may have about this offline or in the future. And kind of the take home point of this, this patch that we made in Solum Reverto Domus, as it says in Latin, for anyone that may know Latin, that means everyone goes home. Which is really our objective here. So the reason that we want to talk about safety third is we want to get people's attention and recognize that safety is not so simple, and that we ultimately want everyone to go home. We want you to go home, we want to go home, and we want that patient to be able to go home to their family too. And that's why we go out there to do it. We're willing to take a few risks to do it, but we want to do it as safely as we can. All right. And that's all I got. Any
comments?
Comments?
Hi mate, Cliff here. That was great talk, and a lot of overlap with how we think and do things here. And it's really interesting to hear your point of view on it. I guess I kind of get the message behind safety third, because we don't want to deprioritize the other equally important things. But I reckon if I was going to get into an American EMS helicopter and it said safety third on the side, I probably wouldn't get in. Do you worry that the message could be misinterpreted?
We've had a lot of talk about that, and this is not the sort of thing that we're putting on the side of our ambulances or putting up in the ambulance bays or things. It's something that we kind of made intentionally inflammatory to try to get people to talk about something that where it's, if you just like, oh, it's just another safety talk. Oh, here's your annual safety training. Here's your safety banner, right? People are just like, yeah, whatever, but what the whole point was to make this intentionally, like, make people stop and be like, whoa, this is totally crazy. Like, this is
the words
absolutely
matter, and we're not saying that safety isn't important. It's saying that there's other things to necessarily prioritize, and all of them are equally important.
Yeah, I guess it's like just thinking, I guess it's like ATLS, isn't it? Where you traditionally start with airway, but in real life, you're doing other things at the same time. And this is a reminder that, yeah, we prioritize safety, but not at the expense of the other things that need to happen at the same time.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
is that ATLS is a perfect example, right? Where, it started with ABCs, right? But then it moved more into March, as we start realizing that, like, oh, well, we kind of know all along that, yeah, ABCs are important, but don't let someone bleed to death while you're trying to intubate them, right? So that's the same, that's this kind of the same idea that optimally we should have a more nuanced approach than just you do this one thing and then you move on and you say, well, I'm having a hard time with the airway, so I'm letting them bleed to death. So that's the that's the kind of conversations that we're trying to have, and this is exactly the kind of conversations we're intending to have with all this.
Yeah, and from my perspective, the train like you fight thing, certainly, they can't hear me if I don't talk on this, but it's really loud if I do. They're very important, EMS. I mean, literally, if you walk into any EMS training school in America and ask any paramedic at every level, what's the first thing? And they're gonna be like, scene safety BSI. And it becomes this like rote thing that's kind of comical, but then you don't realize that they're actually thinking that on scene. And it kind of came to evidence how you train. There was a police officer in a Miami firefight that was using a revolver. And because he'd always trained at the range to unload his revolver into his hand and put the shells in his pocket because he saved them for later, while he's getting shot at, he's unloading the shells into his pocket to save them for later. So, if you don't train like it means something, and so it's unsettling. It's to try and get you out of that just rote memorization, ABC, IVO to monitor advanced air equipment to the bedside, that kind of thing. So.
Yeah, there's another example of that where they would hand the gun back to the person after they finished a, you may have seen they would disarm someone and then hand the gun back, and they're drilled over and over. And there's been multiple examples of police officers disarming someone and then handing the gun right back to the person and being like, oh crap, why did I just do that? But it's these patterns that we create. So it's just trying to bring some more, to not create a pattern like that. Well, I'm going to cede my time over to Ben so he can get some drowning going.
Yeah, it's Garth, one of the paramedics. I think it's a great talk. It's not one for beginners. It's not your first introductory, talk about safety, but it's made me think and pause and go, okay, so why do I think I'm safe? And I found myself in situations this week on my own, and there was a lot of emergency service people around and no one within 200 meters where I felt safe to stand. Okay. And then, so you do check yourself, and at the start of a job, was a water rescue, the start of a job, there's a level of risk you're willing to take within your scope of practice and your training and your expertise, because it's a rescue. As time goes on, it becomes more likely to be a body recovery. Your comfort level shifts, and you change, and you adjust your approach. We've already slid the whole safety scope sideways into the more risky area. Because if you ask your friends how, they think, oh, that's dangerous what you're doing, but you go, no, I'm not. It's not dangerous, or it's dangerous, but I've got the risk assessed. So we've already slid it, but then the mission will affect it, that you need to slide it back towards the safety because there's just risk versus gain isn't there. So I think it's really good. Really good talk.
And that's the one thing that I didn't have time to touch on, but it's something worth talking about in the station or sometime too. Is this the thing that really plays into it is this toxic culture of heroism too, which can really play into it as well. Where this idea that I'm going to take ridiculous risks because I'm supposed to be a hero, I'm supposed to save people at any cost, which is kind of the way other end of things as well, which you need to be aware of as well. So. Anyway, but we could talk about this all day, and I'd love to. If anyone wants to, chat offline about any of these things, I'd love to talk about it. We can chat later.
Also, Cliff, I wouldn't get into an American helicopter even if it didn't say safety third, since it's only been 17 hours since the last crash.
Yeah.
Ben, you got your slides up? Maybe.